The morning sun cut across Fort Campbell's training grounds, like a blade harsh and unforgiving, against the Kentucky clay. In the center of the combat simulation arena, a small woman stood perfectly still while chaos erupted around her. Her tactical vest hung loose on her frame. Her boots were scuffed beyond recognition. And Brock Callahan's 6 feet 2 inches of Ranger-qualified muscle and third-generation military arrogance had both hands wrapped around the collar of her shirt. "This isn't daycare Ashford," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "Time to go home." The fabric tore with a sound that cut through the morning air like a gunshot. And then everything stopped. Because there across Evelyn Ashford's exposed back sprawled an intricate black tattoo that made every man in that training yard freeze in recognition or confusion or something deeper than either. An eagle with spread wings clutching a skull. Old English script wrapping around it. Words that shouldn't exist on the body of a 24-year-old woman who looked like she'd stumbled in from a soup kitchen. Black Operations Group, BOG-7 Recon, classified, never forgotten. Colonel Garrett Steele, 58 years old and harder than the Kentucky limestone beneath his boots, went completely pale. His hand, which had been reaching for his radio, froze halfway to his belt. His mouth opened slightly. And for the first time in 35 years of military service spanning Grenada to the Gulf, and a dozen places in between, that never made the papers, Garrett Steele looked like he'd seen a ghost. Because he had. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't start with the reveal. It starts 72 hours earlier with a beat-up 1985 Chevy pickup truck coughing its way through the main gate of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, trailing blue smoke and the kind of rattling engine noise that made the gate guard wince in sympathy. 72 hours earlier, the truck looked like it had survived a war. Rust ate at the wheel wells. The paint, once probably red, had faded to the color of old brick left too long in the sun. Montana plates. Dents in the driver's side door that suggested either a very bad accident or a very good story. The kind of vehicle you'd see parked outside a roadside diner at 3 in the morning, belonging to someone with nowhere particular to go and no hurry to get there. When it finally shuddered to a stop in the visitor parking lot, the engine gave one final death rattle before surrendering to silence. The driver's door opened with a metallic screech, and out stepped Evelyn Ashford. She was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. 5'4", maybe 125 pounds, soaking wet. Dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that looked like she'd done it herself without benefit of a mirror. No makeup, no jewelry, jeans that were worn thin at the knees and frayed at the hem. A windbreaker so faded that its original color was anyone's guess. Boots that had holes in them, actual holes through which you could see her socks. She moved with a certain economy of motion as she pulled her gear from the truck bed. One backpack held together by a single stubborn strap that had been reinforced with duct tape. One duffel bag that looked like it might have been military issue sometime during the Carter administration. Nothing else. No designer luggage, no matching set, no Louis Vuitton or North Face or any of the brands that usually showed up at Fort Campbell when recruits arrived for the advanced infantry course. She looked, to put it charitably, like she'd taken a wrong turn on her way to a homeless shelter. From the second-floor window of the administrative building, Colonel Garrett Steele watched her cross the parking lot. He'd been reviewing the roster for the new class. 27 recruits, the best and the brightest, supposedly. Or at least the best connected and most politically convenient, which in 1991, post-Desert Storm, when the military was figuring out what the hell it was supposed to be now that the Cold War was over, meant the same thing. And there at the bottom of the list, a name that had made him pause when he'd first seen it. Ashford Evelyn J., age 24. No prior service record. Direct entry into advanced training under some new Pentagon program that Steele didn't fully understand and didn't particularly like. Something about expanding opportunities. About showing the world that American women could handle anything American men could. Politics. Steele hated politics. He'd spent 35 years trying to stay as far away from politics as possible, which was like trying to stay dry in a rainstorm, but he'd done his best. He'd served in Grenada when that was the thing. He'd done his time in classified locations doing classified things with classified people. He'd lost friends in Beirut and Panama and a dozen other places that most Americans couldn't find on a map. And now they wanted him to train women in advanced infantry tactics. Not that he was against it exactly. He'd served alongside women in support roles. Some of them were tougher than most of the men he'd known. But this was different. This was frontline combat training. This was the kind of school where 60% of the men who started didn't finish. And they were sending him a 24-year-old girl who looked like she weighed less than his rucksack. He watched her disappear into the reception building. Then he went back to his roster and made a mental note to keep an eye on Ashford Evelyn J. Not because he expected her to succeed, but because he wanted to be there when she quit. The briefing room was designed to intimidate. Concrete walls painted that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed to exist only in military facilities. Fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly jaundiced, rows of hard plastic chairs bolted to the floor, and at the front, a podium that had seen more nervous recruits than Steele could count. They filed in at 0600 sharp. 27 bodies in various states of physical conditioning, all of them trying very hard to look like they belonged here. Most of them wore their PT gear like armor, new shoes, expensive athletic wear, the kind of stuff you bought when you had something to prove. Evelyn Ashford wore the same faded windbreaker she'd arrived in. She took a seat in the back row near the corner where the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to be annoying. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight but not rigid, her eyes forward but not focused on anything in particular. She looked, Steele thought, from his position near the podium like she was waiting for a bus. Brock Callahan took the front row center seat like he owned it. And in a way he did. Brock was what you got when you combined perfect genes, perfect training, and a family legacy that went back to Normandy. His grandfather had jumped into France with the 101st Airborne. His father had done 2 tours in the last days of Vietnam. Brock himself had been Ranger qualified for 3 years, had served in Desert Storm with distinction, and had letters of recommendation from 2 generals and a senator. He was 6'2", 200 pounds of lean muscle with the kind of square jaw and clear blue eyes that recruiting posters were designed around. When he smiled, which he did often, it was the smile of someone who'd never lost at anything and didn't plan to start. Next to him sat Wade Thornton, who was essentially Brock's shadow-made flesh. Slightly smaller, slightly less impressive, but cut from the same cloth. Wade's father was a colonel. Wade's uncle was a general. Wade had grown up on military bases the way some kids grew up in suburbs. They were in every measurable way exactly the kind of recruits this course was designed for. Steele let them settle, let the room fill with that particular kind of nervous energy that always preceded these briefings. Then he stepped to the podium. "Good morning," his voice carried without being loud. 35 years of command presence earned the hard way. You are here because someone somewhere thinks you have what it takes to be part of this military's next generation of combat leaders. I am here to find out if they're right. He paused. Let that sink in. This is the Advanced Infantry course. It is 12 weeks of the hardest training you will ever experience. Land navigation, weapons proficiency, combat tactics, survival skills, leadership under fire. By the end of this course, you will either be qualified for special operations consideration or you will be gone. Another pause. The washout rate is 60%. That means if you look to your left and to your right, chances are at least one of those people won't be here at the end. Maybe it's them. Maybe it's you. Steele's eyes swept the room, landed briefly on Evelyn Ashford in the back corner. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, just sat there with that same patient expression like she was listening to a weather report. Standards do not change for politics, Steele continued, and there was an edge to his voice now. I don't care what's happening in Washington. I don't care what programs you came in under. I don't care about your last name or your family legacy or who wrote you a letter of recommendation. In this course, you earn your place, or you fail. He let that hang in the air for a moment. You will be divided into teams. You will eat, sleep, and train with those teams. Your success or failure will be measured both individually and collectively. If one person on your team fails, you all carry that weight. If someone needs help, you provide it. If someone can't keep up, you bring them up or you leave them behind. Those are the only 2 options. Brock Callahan's hand went up. Sir, question. Steele nodded. Sir, with all due respect to the new policies, how do we handle physical differences between male and female recruits? I mean, in terms of team dynamics and capability expectations. It was asked professionally, respectfully, but everyone in the room heard what wasn't being said. How do we deal with the girl? Steele's expression didn't change. You handle it by remembering that everyone here met the same entrance standards. You handle it by focusing on your own performance instead of worrying about anyone else's. And you handle it by understanding that if I hear anyone using gender as an excuse for anything, team success or team failure, that person will be gone before lunch. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Outstanding. Now fall out and get to your barracks. Formation at 0700 and for your first exercise. Dismissed. They filed out in a controlled chaos of nervous energy and barely suppressed testosterone. Evelyn Ashford was the last to leave. She moved with that same unhurried pace like she had all the time in the world. As she passed Steele's position near the door, their eyes met for just a second. Hers were brown, dark brown, the kind of brown that was almost black in certain light, and they were completely calm. The mess hall at Fort Campbell had been feeding soldiers since 1942, and it looked like it. Long tables, hard benches, industrial kitchen smells that mixed grease and bleach and something that might have been food, but could just as easily have been cleaning solution. The walls were decorated with unit patches and photographs from every conflict since World War II. Evelyn took her tray to a corner table away from the main flow of traffic. She'd loaded it with the kind of practical efficiency that suggested either a military background or extreme poverty. Protein, carbs, vegetables, nothing fancy. She sat with her back to the wall, a position that gave her a clear view of the entire room, and began eating with the same methodical pace she seemed to apply to everything. Brock Callahan noticed her from across the room. Of course he did. She was the only woman in the course, and she was sitting alone, like she didn't care that she was sitting alone, and that combination was apparently too much for Brock's sense of social order to handle. He grabbed his tray, Wade grabbed his, and together they made their way across the mess hall like a two-man parade. Brock dropped his tray on Evelyn's table with just enough force to make everything rattle. "Yo lost girl," he said, his voice pitched perfectly to carry to the surrounding tables. "You know this ain't a soup kitchen, right? They got actual standards here." Wade laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Evelyn paused her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked up at Brock with those dark eyes calm as still water. "I'm eating," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat, matter of fact, like she was stating an obvious truth to someone who'd somehow missed it. Brock leaned in, smiling his recruitment poster smile. "Yeah, well, eat faster. You're taking up space real soldiers need." Then without warning, he flicked the edge of her tray. Not hard enough to flip it, just hard enough to send a spoonful of mashed potatoes splattering across the front of her shirt. The surrounding tables erupted in laughter. Phones came out. This was content. This was the kind of thing that would play well back home in the group chats and social media feeds, where these guys maintained their carefully curated images of military excellence. Evelyn looked down at her shirt, at the white glob of potatoes sliding slowly toward her lap. Then she reached for her napkin, wiped the mess with slow, methodical movements, and took another bite of food. Like Brock wasn't even there. The deliberate calm of her response seemed to infuriate him more than any comeback could have. His smile tightened, his jaw clenched. For just a second, something ugly flickered across his perfect features. But Wade was laughing and the cameras were recording, and there was an image to maintain. So Brock just shook his head, grabbed his tray, and walked away. "Girl's gonna wash out first week," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet on it." From a table near the serving line, Sergeant First Class Claire Brennan watched the exchange with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned when to intervene and when to let things play out. Claire was 32 Irish-American with red hair she kept in a regulation bun and green eyes that missed very little. She'd been one of the first women to serve in combat support during the Grenada invasion. She'd seen action in Panama. She knew exactly what it cost to be female in a male world, and she knew exactly how to survive it. She'd also noticed something that Brock Callahan in his arrogance had completely missed. When Evelyn Ashford had wiped that mashed potato off her shirt, her hands hadn't shaken. Not even a little. Most people, when humiliated in front of a crowd, show some physiological response. Trembling hands, flushed cheeks, rapid breathing. The autonomic nervous system's way of dealing with social threat. Evelyn's hands had been rock steady, like someone who'd learned somewhere along the way to control her body's stress responses completely. Claire filed that observation away and went back to her coffee. Physical training started at 05:30 the next morning when the Kentucky summer heat was still just a promise on the horizon. Colonel Steele ran the session personally, which was unusual enough that it made the recruits nervous. Push-ups until arms shook, sit-ups until abdominals screamed, burpees in the red clay that left everyone covered in dust and sweat, then a 5-mile run in full-gear rucksacks loaded with the regulation 45 pounds under a sun that climbed from gentle to brutal with vindictive speed. Evelyn Ashford kept pace, not at the front of the pack. That would have been too obvious, too much of a statement, but solidly in the middle, her breathing controlled her stride, economical, her face showing the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was managing her energy carefully. Her boots, though, were a problem. The laces kept coming loose. They were old frayed at the ends, barely holding her boots together. Every quarter mile or so, she'd have to stop, kneel, retie them with quick, efficient movements then rejoined the run. Around mile 3, Brock Callahan jogged up beside her. "Yo, thrift store," he called out loud enough for the group around them to hear. "Your shoes given up, or is that just you?" Laughter rippled through the formation. Evelyn didn't respond. She just kept running, her pace unchanged. "I'm serious," Brock continued playing to his audience. "They got a lost and found at the PX. Maybe someone donated some real boots you could use." More laughter. Evelyn stopped, knelt, retied her laces. And as she did, Brock bumped her shoulder just hard enough to throw her off balance. She went down. Hands hit the red clay. Knees sank into the dust. Her rucksack shifted forward, pulling her further off center. The group slowed, circling like sharks, sensing blood. "Oops," Brock said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You okay there, Ashford? You signing up to clean the floors, or you just planning to be our personal punching bag?" The laughter was louder now, crueler, the kind of pack mentality that emerges when people sense weakness and permission to exploit it. Evelyn got up, wiped her muddy palms on her pants, adjusted her rucksack, and resumed running, her face completely blank. The laughter followed her for the rest of the morning, but if it affected her, she showed no sign. From his position near the finish line, Steele watched the entire exchange through binoculars. Watched Brock's deliberate bump, watched Evelyn's fall in recovery, watched the pack mentality kick in, and watched Evelyn's face remain absolutely neutral throughout. Most recruits, when targeted like that, showed something. Anger, embarrassment, fear, the natural human response to being singled out and humiliated. Evelyn Ashford showed nothing. Either she was very good at hiding her emotions, Steele thought, or she'd been trained to control them so completely that they didn't show. And there was only one kind of training that produced that result. The land navigation exercise came on day 4. 6-hour time limit, 40 kilometers through Kentucky hill country, 8 checkpoints to find using only map, compass, and dead reckoning. No GPS, no radio support, just basic infantry skills and the ability to read terrain like a language. 60% of recruits failed this exercise. They released the recruits in staggered intervals to prevent following. Evelyn drew a mid-pack start time, which meant she'd be navigating through terrain that had already been partially disturbed by earlier runners, but wouldn't have the advantage of completely fresh ground. She checked her compass, studied her map for exactly 2 minutes, then folded it precisely and started moving. Steele watching from the command post, tracking all recruits via the checkpoint verification system. Each checkpoint had a unique marker that recruits had to photograph as proof of arrival. The system logged their times automatically. Brock Callahan came in first as expected. Time 4 hours 32 minutes. All checkpoints verified. Wade Thornton came in second. Time 4 hours 48 minutes. Then at 4 hours 59 minutes, a name popped up on Steele's screen that made him lean forward. Ashford Evelyn J. All checkpoints verified. No errors, no missed markers, no wrong turns that showed up in the timing patterns. She'd navigated the entire course faster than 70% of the men, including several who'd been through advanced training before. When she checked in at the finish point, she wasn't even breathing hard. Brock was waiting, standing with a group of guys who'd finished in the first wave. When Evelyn appeared, he made a show of checking his watch. "Well, well," he said loudly. "Look who actually made it. You get lost out there, sweetheart. Have to ask for directions." The group laughed. Evelyn walked past them to the verification station, said nothing, and sat down on a bench to wait for the rest of the class to finish. But Wade Thornton wasn't ready to let it go. "Seriously though, Ashford, that's a pretty good time. You sure you didn't take any shortcuts? Maybe follow someone else's trail." Evelyn took a drink from her canteen, looked at Wade with those calm, dark eyes. "I followed my compass," she said. "Same as everyone else." "Yeah, but—" "Your concern is noted," she interrupted quietly. "Thanks." Then she went back to her water and ignored them completely. It was Claire Brennan, checking the verification logs later that evening, who noticed something interesting. Evelyn's checkpoint pattern showed she'd taken a route that was different from everyone else's. Not shorter necessarily, but more efficient. She'd recognized terrain features that allowed her to move faster through what looked like difficult ground on the map, but was actually relatively clear forest floor. The kind of route selection you learn from experience. The kind of route selection you didn't learn from basic training. Claire pulled up Evelyn's file on her computer. It was remarkably thin. Age 24, address in Montana, no prior service. Direct entry under the new Pentagon program. That was it. No explanation of where she'd learned to navigate, no background on her physical conditioning, no record of any kind that would explain how someone with zero documented military training could move through Kentucky hill country like she'd been born in it. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she closed the file and decided to keep watching. The equipment shed was where they kept the tactical gear. Vests, helmets, load-bearing harnesses, all the stuff that turned a person into a soldier, at least visually. The quartermaster, a gruff older sergeant named Daniels, who'd been running this shed since the Reagan administration, had seen every kind of recruit there was. The cocky ones, the scared ones, the ones who thought military service was going to be like a video game. When Evelyn Ashford walked in on day 6 to draw her gear for the upcoming exercises, Daniels took one look at her and sighed. "What's this, a hobo convention?" he said loudly, making sure the line of recruits behind her could hear. "We don't got gear for civilians, sweetheart." He tossed a tactical vest at her that was at least 2 sizes too large, the straps dangling uselessly. The recruits behind her snickered. "Maybe she can use it as a tent," someone called out. More laughter. Evelyn caught the vest, her fingers tightening around the canvas for just a moment. A flash of something crossed her face too quick to identify. Then it was gone, replaced by that same neutral expression. She didn't argue, didn't ask for a replacement, just slung the oversized vest over her shoulder and walked out, her boots echoing on the concrete floor. Daniels laughed and shook his head. "That one's gonna wash out by tomorrow," he announced to the room. But outside, away from prying eyes, Evelyn adjusted the oversized vest with a few quick knots and tucks, transforming it into something that actually fit. Her hands moved with practiced precision, the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing something hundreds of times. She pulled the vest tight, checked the fit, adjusted the straps. Perfect. Then she picked up her gear and headed to the barracks. That night, after lights out, she pulled that worn photograph from her backpack again. The photo was old, creased at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. It showed a younger version of Evelyn, maybe 12 years old, standing next to a man in combat fatigues. The man's face was partially visible this time if you looked closely. Weathered, sharp-eyed, the kind of face that had seen things and done things and carried the weight of them without complaint. He was holding a rifle in the photograph. Not for show. It was slung in the way someone carried a rifle when it was a tool, not a prop. And on his shoulder, partially visible beneath his jacket, was the edge of a tattoo. Evelyn traced her finger over the photograph, her expression softer than anyone at Fort Campbell had seen. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway. The photograph disappeared back into her backpack in a movement so fast it was almost a magic trick. By the time the duty officer walked past her bunk on his rounds, Evelyn Ashford was lying perfectly still, hands folded on her chest, staring at the ceiling, with eyes that could have been asleep or could have been wide awake. It was impossible to tell. Weapon maintenance drill came on day 8, and it was designed to separate people who'd actually handled military firearms from people who'd just played Call of Duty. The exercise was simple: field strip an M4 carbine completely. Clean it to military specifications. Reassemble it. Time limit 2 minutes. Fail to reassemble it correctly and you failed the exercise. Take longer than 2 minutes and you failed the exercise. Have any parts left over when you were done and you failed the exercise. It was a straightforward test of basic infantry competence. Sergeant Brooks, the weapons instructor, was a 40-year-old career soldier with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that could stop a riot. He'd been teaching weapons proficiency for 15 years, and he could spot someone who knew their way around a rifle versus someone who was faking it within about 10 seconds. Brock Callahan went first because of course he did. He approached the table with confidence, checked the rifle to make sure it was clear, and started disassembling with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Upper receiver off, bolt carrier group out, firing pin removed. Each part placed in neat order on the cleaning mat. He finished with 17 seconds to spare. Not the fastest time Brooks had ever seen, but solid. Professional. Wade Thornton went next, slightly slower, a few fumbles, but he got it done in 1 minute 53 seconds. Others followed. Some made it, some didn't. The failure pile started growing. Then Evelyn Ashford stepped up to the table. She looked at the rifle like she was greeting an old friend. Picked it up. Checked the chamber. Checked the magazine well. Then her hands started moving. Not fast exactly, not rushed, but with a kind of flowing precision that made the whole process look choreographed. Pin out. Upper receiver separated. Bolt carrier group removed. Each piece placed in perfect alignment on the mat, not by conscious thought, but by muscle memory so deep it was essentially instinct. Brooks watched his expression shifting from skepticism to interest to something approaching surprise. Cleaning was similarly methodical. Each part wiped, inspected, set aside. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Reassembly was the same. Parts flowed back together like they'd never been separated. Click, snap, lock, function check. Brooks looked at the timer. 52 seconds. He looked at the rifle. Every part in place. Every function correct. He looked at Evelyn. Ashford, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Where'd you learn to do that? Evelyn wiped her hands on her pants, her eyes fixed somewhere around his chest level. Practice sergeant, she said. Practice where? Home sergeant. Home where? Montana sergeant. Brooks studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Outstanding. Next. But after the exercise, he pulled Colonel Steele aside. Sir, that girl, Ashford. What about her? She field stripped that M4 like she's been doing it since she was 10 years old. 52 seconds, sir. That's faster than most of my instructors. Steele's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Noted, Sergeant. Anything else? Her hands didn't shake once, sir, not once. That's the kind of muscle control you see in special operations, not some kid from Montana with no prior service. Steele nodded slowly. Keep an eye on her, Sergeant. Let me know if you see anything else. Yes, sir. After Brooks left, Steele went back to his office and pulled Evelyn's file again. Still mostly empty. He sat there for a long time staring at that name. Ashford. It was familiar. He knew it from somewhere. Not common knowledge. Something older. Something from before. Then it hit him. He opened his bottom desk drawer, the one he kept locked, and pulled out a worn folder that had been sitting there for almost a decade. Personal effects, photographs. Things from his time in operations that technically didn't exist. He flipped through until he found what he was looking for. A unit photograph from 1983. Grenada, Point Salines Airport. His team before things went bad. 12 men in combat gear, tired and alive, standing in front of a shot-up building. And their third from the left with sharp eyes and a slight smile. Captain Jack Ashford. Call sign Phantom. Steele's hands went very still. He pulled Evelyn's file photo. Compared it to the man in the photograph from 1983. Same eyes, same bone structure, same subtle intensity in the way they both looked at the camera like they were seeing something beyond the lens. Jesus, Steele whispered. Then he picked up his phone and made a call to an old friend at the Pentagon. Someone who owed him favors. Someone who could access records that weren't supposed to exist. I need information on a Black Operations Group member, Steele said when the line connected. Jack Ashford, call sign Phantom, listed as MIA Panama, December 1989. There was a long pause on the other end. Jesus, Garrett, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. What's this about, Almas? Just answer the question. What happened to him? Another pause. The sound of typing. Official record says MIA during classified operation. No body recovered. Presumed KIA by enemy action. And the unofficial record. There is no unofficial record, Garrett. You know how BOG worked. Those guys disappeared. That was it. But you were there. You processed those reports. What really happened? A sigh. Off the record, complete off the record, completely. Rumor was he survived, got out of Panama, went underground. Something about classified exposure things he knew that couldn't be acknowledged. OD wanted him gone, so he went. New identity? Montana, I think. Died a few years later. Cancer. Agent Orange exposure from earlier operations. Steele's grip on the phone tightened. Did he have family? How the hell would I know that? This was 10 years ago and it was barely documented then. Guess. Another pause. Maybe. I seem to remember something about a daughter. Why? Because I think she just showed up at my training course. The line went dead silent. Then, Garrett, if that's true, you need to be very careful. Those BOG guys, especially Phantom, they didn't just train soldiers. They created something else. Something we don't entirely understand. If she's his daughter, if he trained her, I know. Because Jack Ashford wasn't just good. He was something beyond good. They called him Phantom for a reason. Enemy never saw him, never knew he was there. And the things he could do with a rifle at distance. I was there, Steele interrupted. I know what he could do. He saved my life. Then you know what I'm talking about. If he passed that on to his daughter. Yeah, Steele said quietly. I know. He hung up. Sat in his office as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Tomorrow was the long-range marksmanship qualification. 800 yards. 5 shots. Pass or fail. And Steele had a feeling that tomorrow, one way or another, he was going to get his answers. The rifle range at Fort Campbell stretched across a valley that had been carved from Kentucky limestone and red clay sometime back in the 1950s. 800 yards of carefully maintained sight lines with target berms at intervals that tested everything from basic marksmanship to the kind of precision shooting that separated soldiers from snipers. The morning air was thick with humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin before you'd even started sweating. Heat shimmer was already rising off the ground, distorting the air between firing positions and targets like water running down glass. Colonel Steele stood at the range control tower, watching the recruits file in for their long-range qualification. This was the make-or-break exercise. 5 shots at 800 yards with the M24 sniper weapon system. You needed 3 hits to pass. 2 hits or fewer, and you were done. Immediate dismissal from the course. No second chances, no do-overs. Just you, the rifle, the target, and 800 yards of Kentucky air that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss if you didn't understand how wind and heat and humidity played games with bullets in flight. The M24 was a beautiful weapon if you appreciated that sort of thing. Based on the Remington 700, it had been the military's standard sniper rifle since the late 80s. Not the newest technology, not the fanciest optics, but reliable, accurate, and unforgiving of mistakes. Exactly the kind of weapon that revealed who actually knew what they were doing versus who just thought they did. Brock Callahan was first on the line because he'd scored highest on the previous day's known distance qualifications. He approached the firing position with the kind of swagger that came from never having failed at anything physical in his entire life. He settled into position behind the rifle, spent a solid 2 minutes adjusting the scope, checking the wind flags, making small calculations on a notepad he'd brought specifically for this purpose. Professional, methodical, everything by the book. First shot hit, center mass on the target, maybe 4 inches right, a perfect center. The spotters called it good. Brock adjusted slightly. Second shot hit, closer to center this time. Third shot hit, almost perfect. Fourth shot miss. The wind had shifted just as he squeezed the trigger, and the bullet went wide by maybe 6 inches. Fifth shot hit, 4 out of 5. Solid performance. The kind of score that would have been impressive at any military range in the country. Brock stood up confident, already thinking about the beers he'd buy tonight to celebrate maintaining his #1 position. Wade Thornton went next. Took his time, got 3 hits out of 5, which was passing, but nothing spectacular. Others followed. Some passed, some failed. The pattern was predictable. The guys who'd grown up hunting, who understood rifles as tools rather than toys, generally did okay. The guys who'd learned everything from video games and basic training generally struggled. By the time they'd worked through 15 recruits, the morning had turned genuinely hot. The heat shimmer was worse now, making the targets look like they were underwater. Sergeant Brooks called the next name. Ashford Evelyn. You're up. She'd been sitting in the waiting area cross-legged on the ground doing absolutely nothing. Not studying notes, not watching the other shooters, just sitting there with that same patient expression like she was waiting for something inevitable. She stood, walked to the firing position, checked the rifle to make sure it was clear. Then she did something that made Brooks raise an eyebrow. She didn't adjust the scope, didn't check the wind flags, didn't pull out any notes or calculations. She just settled into position behind the rifle, her body forming the kind of stable shooting platform that usually took years to develop. Bone support, not muscle. Weight distributed perfectly. Her breathing slowed, deepened, became something measured and controlled. For just a moment, she was completely still. Then she fired. The shot broke clean, the rifle recoiling smoothly into her shoulder. 800 yards downrange, the target, spotters called it. Center mass, dead center. Brooks leaned forward slightly. One good shot didn't mean anything. Could be luck, could be coincidence. Evelyn's breathing cycled. In, halfway out. Second shot, center mass, dead center. Now Brooks was paying attention. Steele, watching from the tower, raised his binoculars. Third shot, same breathing pattern, same absolute stillness before the break. Center mass, dead center. The other recruits had stopped what they were doing. Even Brock, who'd been joking with Wade about something, had gone quiet. Fourth shot, center mass, dead center. Steele's hands tightened on the binoculars. Fifth shot, no hesitation, no adjustment. Just the same mechanical precision she'd shown on every previous round. Center mass, dead center. Perfect 5 for 5, in conditions that had caused multiple recruits to fail completely, with no scope adjustments, with no visible compensation for wind or heat or any of the 100 variables that made long-range shooting more art than science. Brooks walked down to the firing line, his face carefully neutral. He picked up the M24, checked the scope setting. Then he turned to Evelyn, who was standing at parade rest waiting. Ashford, he said quietly, this scope is set for 500 yards. She said nothing. You just shot 800 yards with a scope zeroed for 500. That means you compensated 300 yards worth of bullet drop using holdover alone. Still nothing. Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? Evelyn's eyes were fixed on the middle distance, not quite meeting his. My father taught me, Sergeant. Your father? Yes, Sergeant. What did your father do? He was a soldier, Sergeant. Brooks studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Outstanding shooting, Ashford. Best score I've seen in 15 years running this range. You can head back to the waiting area. She nodded once and walked away, her stride unhurried like she just completed a routine task rather than something that should have been impossible. In the tower, Steele lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed him. He'd stopped having physical reactions to things years ago. But he'd just watched someone shoot like Jack Ashford used to shoot. And that was something that made even hardened combat veterans take notice. He picked up his radio. Brooks, secure that weapon. I want it checked by the armorers. Full inspection. Brooks's voice came back confused. Sir, is there a problem? Just do it, Sergeant. 20 minutes later, the armorers confirmed what Steele had already suspected. The scope on the M24 that Evelyn had fired wasn't just set wrong, it was damaged. The reticle was misaligned by almost 2 full minutes of angle enough to throw shots off by a foot or more at 800 yards. Someone had loosened the mounting screws just enough to create the problem, but not enough that it would be obvious during a casual inspection. Sabotage. Deliberate, calculated sabotage. And Evelyn Ashford had compensated for it perfectly without saying a word, without making an excuse, without doing anything, except putting 5 rounds exactly where they needed to go. Steele sat in his office that evening alone with the lights off and a glass of bourbon he wasn't drinking sitting on his desk. On his computer screen was a file that technically didn't exist. Black Operations Group personnel records classified above top secret, accessible only to people with very specific clearances and very specific reasons. He'd pulled every favor he had to get this file, and now he was reading about Captain Jack Phantom Ashford, born 1944, enlisted 1962, Special Forces qualified 1965, multiple tours in classified locations doing classified things. By 1980, he was part of something that officially never existed. The Black Operations Group, a unit that handled missions too sensitive for regular special operations. The unit patch showed an eagle with spread wings clutching a skull. Old English script, Black Operations Group. Unit designation, BOG-7 Recon. The same design Steele had tattooed on his own shoulder earned during 3 months in 1983 when he'd been temporarily assigned to work with BOG-7 on the Grenada operation. The same design he'd glimpsed very briefly in that photograph Evelyn had been looking at in the barracks. Jack Ashford's specialty had been long-range reconnaissance and precision elimination. He could move through hostile territory like smoke, get within shooting distance of targets that should have been impossible to reach, and disappear before anyone knew he'd been there. They'd called him Phantom because that's exactly what he was, a ghost. There, one moment gone, the next, leaving only dead enemies and confused survivors in his wake. The official records said he'd been killed in action during a classified operation in Panama, December 1989. Nobody recovered, presumed dead by enemy action. But Steele had made more calls that afternoon, had talked to people who'd worked BOG logistics, had pieced together a different story. Jack Ashford hadn't died in Panama. He'd survived, had gotten out, had known things about classified operations that couldn't be acknowledged, had seen things that couldn't be explained, had done things that would cause international incidents if they ever came to light. So the Department of Defense had done what it always did in those situations. They'd made him disappear. New identity, new location, enough money to live quietly and never cause problems. Montana wilderness, small ranch, no neighbors for miles, and a daughter. Evelyn Jane Ashford, born 1967, which would make her 24 now. Mother died in childbirth according to the fragmentary records Steele could access. Raised by her father in isolation, homeschooled, no public records until she turned 18 and applied for a driver's license. No prior military service, but clearly extensively trained. The phone on Steele's desk rang. He picked it up without looking away from the screen. Steele. Sir, it's Brooks. I checked the duty roster for range preparation. That rifle Ashford used was assigned to her specifically. But Wade Thornton signed out tools from the armory yesterday evening, said he needed to do maintenance on his personal weapon. Tools that could have been used to loosen scope mounts. Yes, sir. Steele closed his eyes. Thank you, Sergeant. I'll handle it. He hung up, sat there in the darkness for another minute. Then he opened his bottom drawer, pulled out that old photograph from Grenada, and studied Jack Ashford's face. They'd served together for 3 months, had shared a fighting position during the assault on Point Salines Airport when everything had gone to hell, had survived an ambush that should have killed them both because Jack had made an impossible shot at 1,100 yards with iron sights and a rifle he'd picked up off a dead enemy soldier. Steele owed Jack Ashford his life. And now Jack Ashford's daughter was here being sabotaged by entitled children who didn't understand what they were dealing with. That was going to stop. The night exercise started at 2,200 hours under a moon that was 3/4 full and bright enough to cast shadows. The assignment was straightforward: navigate 2 kilometers through wooded terrain, reach a designated observation point, identify 3 specific targets using night vision equipment, and report back without being detected by the instructor cadre positioned throughout the course. Standard infiltration exercise. The kind of thing that separated people who could move quietly from people who just thought they could. Evelyn drew a mid-pack start position again. She checked her gear with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Night vision goggles, compass, map, notepad, everything secured so it wouldn't rattle or reflect light. Claire Brennan was running the observation point tonight. She'd volunteered specifically, though she hadn't explained why. She just wanted to see how Evelyn moved when she thought no one important was watching. The recruits were released at 5-minute intervals. Brock Callahan went third. Wade Thornton went fifth, both of them carrying themselves with the confidence of men who'd done this kind of thing before and expected to excel at it. Evelyn went seventh. She disappeared into the tree line like she'd been erased from reality. One moment she was there, visible in the moonlight, the next she was simply gone. Claire, watching from the observation point with thermal imaging equipment, tracked the recruits as they moved through the course. Most of them were easy to follow. They made noise, broke branches, disturbed the ground in ways that showed up clearly in the thermal scope. Brock and Wade were better than average. They moved carefully, used the terrain for concealment, made good time without being reckless. But Evelyn was something else entirely. Claire lost her almost immediately. The thermal signature just vanished into the background clutter of the forest. No movement pattern, no heat trail. Nothing that indicated a human being was moving through that terrain. For 15 minutes, Claire scanned the approach routes, looking for any sign of the small woman who should have been visible somewhere in the grid. Nothing. Then, from approximately 10 feet behind Claire's position, a quiet voice said, 3 targets identified, Sergeant. Alpha at grid 247, Bravo at grid 251, Charlie at grid 255, all confirmed through night vision. Claire spun around so fast she nearly dropped the thermal scope. Evelyn was standing there, barely visible in the shadows, her night vision goggles pushed up on her head, her expression neutral. Jesus Christ, Claire breathed. How long have you been there? Approximately 4 minutes, Sergeant. 4 minutes I've been scanning this entire sector. I didn't see you approach. I used the terrain depression to the west, Sergeant. Came in from the high side to avoid your thermal line of sight. Claire stared at her. That approach route was the hardest possible path. It required moving through dense undergrowth in near total darkness, navigating around sensor positions that most of the recruits didn't even know existed. Who taught you to move like that? For just a second, something flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Something that might have been memory, or might have been pain, or might have been both. My father, Sergeant. Your father must have been one hell of a soldier. Yes, Sergeant, he was. Then she faded back into the darkness before Claire could ask anything else. But 30 yards into the trees, Evelyn encountered a problem she hadn't anticipated. Brock Callahan and Wade Thornton, who'd been tracking her movement through the forest using techniques they'd learned in Ranger School, had set up an ambush point along what they'd correctly guessed would be her exfiltration route. They were supposed to be completing the exercise. Instead, they were hunting her. Evelyn knew they were there before she could see them. Small things. The smell of Wade's aftershave, which he wore too much of. The faint sound of fabric on fabric as Brock shifted position. The irregular pattern of shadows that indicated human shapes trying to blend with natural terrain, but not quite succeeding. She could have gone around them, should have gone around them. But something in her recognized this for what it was. Not just a training exercise anymore. This was personal. This was them deciding that they needed to put her in her place, needed to make her fail, needed to prove that she didn't belong. So instead of avoiding them, she stopped, knelt down in the darkness, and waited. Brock's voice carried through the trees, pitched low, but not low enough. She has to come through here. There's no other route back to the assembly point. Wade's response was quieter, harder to make out, but the tone was clear enough. Anticipation, excitement, the feeling of hunters closing in on prey. Evelyn felt something settle over her like a familiar coat. Her father had called it the operator's mindset, the place you went when the mission required you to stop being a person and become a function. No emotion, no hesitation, just the task and the execution. She moved, not away from them, toward them, but at an angle they wouldn't expect, using a route that put her uphill from their position, approaching from the direction they'd already cleared, because people rarely checked their six once they'd decided a sector was secure. She got within 15 feet before Wade sensed something and started to turn. By then it was too late. She wasn't trying to hurt them. That wasn't the mission. The mission was to get past them, get back to the assembly point, and complete the exercise. But she wasn't going to let them stop her either. Wade turned just as she ghost-stepped past his position, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to call out. Evelyn kept moving, and he lost her in the shadows before he could figure out where she'd gone. "Brock," Wade hissed. "She's here. She's right here. I just saw." But Evelyn was already past them, 20 yards beyond their ambush point, moving through the forest like water through stones. Behind her, she heard Brock's frustrated curse and Wade's confused protests. Heard them trying to figure out how she'd gotten past them when they'd been watching the route so carefully. She didn't look back, just kept moving until she reached the assembly point, checked in with the duty officer, and reported completion of the exercise. Total time 47 minutes. Second fastest completion in the exercise's history. The fastest had been set by a Navy SEAL instructor 3 years earlier. When Brock and Wade finally made it back to the assembly point 20 minutes later, covered in scratches from forcing their way through the undergrowth trying to track her, they found Evelyn sitting on a log, calmly cleaning her night vision goggles. She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them. Just sat there in the moonlight, maintaining her equipment like she hadn't just humiliated them both. Brock's face was red with anger and exertion. "You were out of bounds," he said loudly, making sure the duty officer could hear. "Had to be. There's no way you got past our position staying on course." The duty officer, a captain who'd been running these exercises for 5 years, pulled up the tracking data. Every recruit wore a small GPS tracker during night exercises, hidden in their gear, that logged their entire route. "Ashford stayed on course the entire time," the captain said, his voice neutral. "Her track shows she came within approximately 15 feet of your position and continued past it without deviation." Brock stared at the screen, then at Evelyn, then back at the screen. "That's impossible." Evelyn looked up from her equipment for the first time, met his eyes with that same calm, dark gaze. "Is it?" she asked quietly. And in that moment, Brock Callahan realized something that made his stomach drop. She'd known they were there, had known they were waiting, and had moved past them anyway, not because she'd gotten lucky, but because she was operating on a completely different level than anyone else in this course, including him. The realization was there in his eyes, the sudden understanding that he wasn't the best anymore, that he might never have been the best, that all his training and all his confidence and all his family legacy meant exactly nothing against someone who'd been forged into something harder and sharper than he could comprehend. And he hated her for it. Steele heard about the incident within an hour, heard about the ambush attempt that wasn't technically against the rules but definitely violated the spirit of the exercise. Heard about how Evelyn had ghost-walked right past 2 Ranger-qualified soldiers in the dark. He was sitting in his office again late at night when Claire Brennan knocked on his door. "Come in." She entered, still in her field gear, and stood at attention. "At ease, Sergeant. What's on your mind?" "Sir, I need to tell you something about Ashford." Steele gestured to the chair across from his desk. Claire sat. "I've been watching her, sir, not officially, just paying attention. And I've noticed things, such as she moves like someone who's had professional training, not basic infantry, not even ranger school, something deeper. She navigated that night course using routes that required knowledge of terrain, exploitation techniques that aren't taught in any curriculum I'm aware of." Steele said nothing, just waited. "And the way she handled that sabotaged rifle yesterday? Sir, I was at the range. I saw her check the scope, saw her realize something was wrong, and saw her compensate without saying a word. That's not normal. That's someone who's been taught to adapt and overcome at a level that most special operations soldiers don't reach until years into their careers." "Your point, Sergeant." Claire hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, I think she's been trained by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. someone with real operational experience. And I think whoever trained her did it for a reason. This isn't just some girl trying to prove women can do infantry. This is something else. Steele pulled open his bottom drawer, withdrew that photograph from Grenada, slid it across the desk. Claire looked at it, her eyes scanning the faces. Third from the left, Steele said quietly. Claire studied the man in the photograph. Sharp eyes, weathered face. The stance of someone who carried weapons like other people carried briefcases. Who is he? Captain Jack Ashford, call sign Phantom, Black Operations Group, one of the best operators I ever served with. He saved my life and the lives of 12 other men during the Grenada operation. What happened to him? Officially killed in action Panama 1989. Unofficially, he survived. Went into hiding, lived in Montana under a new identity until cancer killed him in 1990. Claire looked up sharply. Montana. That's right. Ashford's from Montana, sir. I know. Understanding dawned in Claire's eyes. She's his daughter. I believe so. And he trained her. For over a decade, if my timeline is correct. From childhood. Everything he knew. Everything he'd learned in the 25 years of classified operations. Claire sat back in her chair, processing. That's why she can do things that shouldn't be possible for someone with no military record. That's exactly why. Sir, does she know that you know? Not yet? What are you going to do? Steele looked at the photograph for a long moment, at Jack Ashford's face, at the memory of a friend and brother-in-arms who died alone in Montana carrying secrets that would never be acknowledged. I'm going to make sure she gets a fair shot at completing this course, and I'm going to make damn sure that Callahan and Thornton don't sabotage her again. How? By watching. And by making it clear that anyone who interferes with another recruit's performance will be dismissed immediately. Claire nodded. There's something else, sir. Go on. The final exercise, combat simulation, hand-to-hand qualification. It's scheduled for tomorrow. I know. Sir, the pairings are done by ranking, which means Ashford will be paired with Callahan. Yes, sir, and Callahan's ego can't handle being shown up by her anymore. He's going to try something. Steele's jaw tightened. Then we'll be watching very closely, won't we? Claire stood, came to attention. Yes, sir. Permission to continue monitoring. Granted. Dismissed. After she left, Steele sat alone in the dark again, thinking about tomorrow. Combat simulation was designed to test hand-to-hand fighting skills, tactical thinking under pressure, and the ability to function when things went physical. It was controlled, supervised, supposed to be safe. But Steele had been running training courses long enough to know that when you put young men full of testosterone and wounded pride into physical confrontations, things could go wrong very quickly. And Brock Callahan's pride had been wounded badly. He pulled out his phone and made one more call. Medical, this is Colonel Steele. I need a full trauma team standing by tomorrow morning at the combat simulation range. Full team, not just a medic. The voice on the other end sounded confused. Sir, is there an expected injury? Let's call it a precaution. Yes, sir. Steele hung up. Then he looked at that photograph one more time at Jack Ashford's face and made a silent promise to a dead friend. I'll keep her safe. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll make sure she gets through this. Outside, the Kentucky night was full of crickets and heat and the distant sound of soldiers training for wars that might never come. And in her barracks bunk, Evelyn Ashford lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about her father and about tomorrow and about the fact that she'd seen Brock Callahan's face after the night exercise. She knew what was coming, had known it was coming since the moment she'd arrived at Fort Campbell and seen the way these men looked at her. Some fights her father had told her you can't avoid. When they come, you handle them, quickly, efficiently, without mercy, and then you move on. She closed her eyes and began the mental preparation routine her father had taught her. Controlled breathing, muscle relaxation, mental rehearsal of techniques and responses. By the time she fell asleep 2 hours before dawn, she was ready for whatever came next. The combat simulation arena at Fort Campbell had been designed in the mid-70s when hand-to-hand combat training was still considered essential to military readiness. It was a circular pit 30 feet across, floored with dense rubber matting that was supposed to prevent injuries but mostly just prevented lawsuits. Around the perimeter, a chain-link fence rose 8 feet high, more for keeping spectators back than keeping combatants in. The morning sun was already brutal at 0700, turning the arena into an oven that smelled of rubber and old sweat and the particular kind of nervous tension that preceded sanctioned violence. Colonel Steele stood at the fence line, his arms crossed, his face expressionless. Behind him, the medical team he'd requested waited with their equipment, looking slightly confused about why they were here for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Claire Brennan stood to his left, her green eyes tracking every movement in the arena with the focus of someone who knew exactly what violence looked like when it was about to happen. The recruits formed a loose semicircle around the pit, 27 faces, most of them eager, some nervous, a few calculating. This was the penultimate exercise of the course. After this, only the final field problem remained. Pass this, and you were almost guaranteed to graduate. Fail this, and you went home. Sergeant Brooks stood in the center of the arena, his voice carrying across the morning air, with the authority of 15 years teaching soldiers how to hurt each other efficiently. Hand-to-hand combat qualification. One-on-one matches, 3-minute round submission or unconsciousness ends the fight. You will be paired according to your current class ranking. Standard grappling rules apply. No strikes to the groin, throat, or eyes. No small joint manipulation. Everything else is fair game. He consulted his clipboard. First match, Callahan versus Ashford. There was a collective intake of breath from the assembled recruits. Some of them glanced at Evelyn with something that might have been pity. Others looked at Brock with anticipation. This was going to be a show. Brock Callahan stepped into the arena like a gladiator entering the Coliseum. He was wearing standard PT gear shorts and a fitted shirt that showed off the physique he'd spent thousands of hours building. 6'2", 210 pounds of muscle that had been refined through years of ranger training and competitive wrestling in high school. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, and smiled that recruitment poster smile. Evelyn Ashford stepped into the arena like she was walking to the mess hall. Same efficient motions, same neutral expression. She was wearing the same faded PT shirt she'd worn since day one, the fabric thin enough that you could see the outline of something dark underneath it. A tank top, maybe? Or a sports bra. She stood 5'4", weighed maybe 125 pounds. Next to Brock, she looked like a child. Wade Thornton, standing at the fence with the other recruits, leaned over to one of his buddies. $10, she taps out in under a minute. I'll take that bet, 30 seconds max. They shook on it, grinning. Brooks looked at both combatants. This is controlled training. You fight until submission or unconsciousness. You protect your partner. You train smart. Understood? Yes, Sergeant, Brock said, his voice confident. Yes, Sergeant, Evelyn said, her voice quiet. Take your positions. They moved to opposite sides of the matted circle. Brooks raised his hand. Ready. Brock settled into a wrestler's stance, weight balanced, hands up, looking for the takedown opportunity that would let him use his size advantage. Evelyn simply stood there, arms at her sides, watching him with steady focus. Fight! Brock didn't wait, didn't circle, didn't probe for weaknesses. He charged straight at her like a linebacker going for a tackle, both hands reaching for her collar, intending to grab her, lift her, and slam her into the mat hard enough to knock the wind out of her and make this whole thing academic. His hands closed on the fabric of her shirt. And then several things happened very quickly. First, the shirt tore, not just a little. The entire front panel ripped away from the shoulder seam, the old fabric giving up under the stress of Brock's grip and Evelyn's sudden movement. Second, Brock's momentum carried him forward into what should have been a successful tackle, except Evelyn wasn't there anymore. She'd moved just slightly, just enough that his hands slid off her, and his weight carried him past her position. Third, and most importantly, the torn shirt fell away, completely exposing Evelyn's back. And everything stopped. Because they're spread across Evelyn Ashford's shoulder blades and upper back in intricate black ink that seemed to absorb the morning light was a tattoo that made every person watching freeze in recognition or confusion, or something deeper than either. An eagle with wings spread wide, talons extended, clutching a human skull. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather individually rendered. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to stare at whoever looked at it. And wrapped around the entire design in Old English script that looked like it had been carved rather than inked were words that most people in that arena had never seen outside of classified briefing rooms. Black Operations Group, BOG-7 Recon, 1980 to 1989. Classified, never forgotten. And beneath it all, in smaller script that you had to look closely to read, Phantom's Legacy. The laughter died, the betting stopped. Phones that had been raised to record what everyone thought would be a quick humiliation lowered slowly. Brock Callahan, who'd been recovering his balance for another attack, went completely still. His face, which had been flushed with exertion and anticipation, went pale. Wade Thornton's mouth fell open, and Colonel Garrett Steele, standing at the fence line, felt his entire world shift on its axis. because he'd suspected, had guessed, had pieced together enough evidence over the past week to be reasonably certain. But seeing that tattoo, that specific design that he'd only ever seen on the shoulders of 12 men who'd served in the most classified unit in modern military history, made it real in a way that files and phone calls and deduction never could. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then Steele was moving, stepping over the low barrier that separated the spectator area from the combat arena, his boots hitting the mat with purpose. "Cease exercise," he said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "Everyone hold position." He walked toward Evelyn, who had turned slightly to face him, the torn shirt hanging from one shoulder, her back fully exposed to the morning sun. Steele's hands were shaking. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to see every line of ink, every detail of the design that had been burned into his own shoulder in a makeshift tattoo shop in Grenada, while artillery fire echoed in the distance. "Who gave you permission to wear that mark?" he asked, and his voice was shaking too, which made him angry because he'd stopped having uncontrolled emotional responses to things decades ago. Evelyn stood at attention, her gaze fixed somewhere past his left shoulder, military bearing perfect despite the destroyed shirt. "I didn't ask permission, sir. It was given to me." "By who?" "By my father, sir." The arena was absolutely silent now. Every recruit, every instructor, every person within earshot had stopped breathing. "Your father's name, Ashford." "Captain Jack Ashford, sir. Call sign Phantom. Black Operations Group Unit 7 Reconnaissance. Listed missing in action, Panama. December 1989. Steele closed his eyes. Opened them. The tattoo was still there, still real, still carrying implications that made his chest tight. "Jack Ashford is dead." "Officially, yes, sir." Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that sounded like grief held under very tight control. "Actually, he died in February 1990. Pancreatic cancer. Complications from chemical exposure during classified operations in Central America." "Chemical exposure." "Agent Orange variant, sir. Defoliant used in classified jungle operations that officially never happened. The cancer was aggressive. He had 8 weeks from diagnosis to death." Steele felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Jack Ashford, Phantom, the best operator he'd ever known. The man who'd saved his life at Point Salines when everything went to hell and stayed to hell. Dead of cancer in Montana while the Pentagon pretended he'd never existed. "Where?" Steele's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Small ranch outside Missoula, Montana, sir. He went into hiding after Panama. New identity, new life. The Department of Defense wanted certain operations buried, and he knew too much about them to be allowed to continue in service. So they gave him a new identity and pension and made him disappear." "Yes, sir." Steele reached up slowly and began unbuttoning his uniform shirt. Claire Brennan's eyes went wide. Several recruits looked at each other in confusion. He pulled the shirt off his left shoulder, exposing his upper arm, where an identical tattoo, faded now, but still clearly visible, showed the same eagle, the same skull, the same Old English script. "Black Operations Group, BOG-7 Recon." The arena exploded in whispers and shocked exclamations. Steele's voice carried over them all. "I served with your father in Grenada, October 1983, Point Salines airport operation. When our position was overrun and we were pinned down by enemy fire with casualties mounting and ammunition running low, your father made a shot that should have been impossible. 1,100 yards, iron sights on a rifle he'd picked up off a dead Cuban soldier. Wind blowing 20 knots. Elevation change of 300 feet. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "He killed the enemy commander with a single shot, changed the entire dynamic of the engagement, gave us time to consolidate, evacuate our wounded, and take that airfield. 13 men lived that day because of what your father did." Evelyn's gaze, which had been fixed on the middle distance, finally met his. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Campbell, something cracked in her controlled expression. "He never talked about Grenada, sir. Said it was classified." "It was. Most of what we did there stayed classified for years. But I remember every second of that day. And I remember your father telling me afterward, while we were sitting in a shot-up building waiting for extraction, that the best operators are the ones nobody knows exist." "He said that to me too, sir," Evelyn whispered. "Said it was the last lesson he ever taught me, week before he died." Steele's jaw tightened. Then, in a movement that made every person watching hold their breath, he came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. To a 24-year-old woman standing in a torn PT shirt in the middle of a training arena, his voice carried across the entire compound. Your father was the finest operator I ever knew, the best soldier I ever served with. And you, Ashford, you're carrying his legacy exactly the way it deserves to be carried." Evelyn's hand came up in an automatic return salute, her eyes bright with tears that she was fighting very hard not to shed. They held the salute for 5 seconds. That felt eternal. Then Steele dropped his hand, and the spell broke. He turned to face the assembled recruits, his voice hard, now command voice, the tone that had led men through combat in 3 different countries. "You are looking at the daughter of a man who gave everything for this country, who served in operations so classified that most of you don't have clearance to know they existed, who lived in hiding for the last year of his life because he knew secrets that could never be acknowledged, and who spent that time training his daughter to be something that very few people in this world ever become." He let that sink in. "So when you look at Ashford, when you wonder how she can do the things she does, when you question whether she belongs here, I want you to remember something. She was trained by a man who could move through enemy territory like smoke, who could make shots that defied physics, who saved my life and the lives of 12 other men through pure skill and courage." His eyes found Brock Callahan, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the mat. "She has earned her place here 100 times over. Not because of her father's legacy, because she's proven repeatedly that she has the skills and the discipline and the heart that we claim to value in soldiers." Silence. Then from somewhere into the crowd of recruits, someone started clapping. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire arena was applauding, the sound echoing off the chain-link fence. Evelyn stood there, torn shirt hanging off one shoulder, tattoo exposed to the morning sun, tears finally breaking through her control and running down her face, and she couldn't stop them anymore. Steele stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He would be so proud of you." "I hope so, sir. I know so, because I knew him, and I know what it took for him to teach you everything he knew while he was dying." Evelyn's breath hitched. "He made me promise, sir. Made me promise I'd use what he taught me. Said there would come a time when it mattered, when someone would need what only I could do. Said that's what it meant to carry the legacy. You're honoring that promise every day you're here." She nodded, unable to speak. Steele turned back to the arena. "Brooks, get Ashford a replacement shirt. Exercise is postponed until after lunch. Everyone else dismissed to barracks. Move." They scattered, voices rising in excited conversation, everyone trying to process what they'd just witnessed. But Brock Callahan stood frozen in the center of the mat, staring at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time. All the arrogance was gone. All the confidence. All the casual cruelty that had defined his interactions with her since day one. In its place was something that looked like shame. And maybe underneath that, a small kernel of understanding. "Ashford," he said quietly. She looked at him, her face still wet with tears. "I'm sorry for all of it. The tray, the rifle, the night exercise. I thought you were just some girl trying to prove a point. I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," Evelyn interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "You just needed to treat me like a soldier, like someone who belonged here. That's all." Brock opened his mouth, closed it, nodded slowly. "I'll do better from now on. That's all anyone can ask." He walked out of the arena, and Wade Thornton followed both of them, looking like they'd been handed a lesson they'd spend years unpacking. Claire Brennan approached with a replacement shirt, but also with something else in her expression. Recognition. Understanding. "Sergeant," Evelyn said quietly. "I knew there was something," Claire said, handing over the shirt. "From day one. The way you moved. The control. I couldn't place it, but I knew." Evelyn pulled on the fresh shirt covering the tattoo again. "Most people don't see it, Sergeant. That's the point. Your father trained you well. He trained me to survive, to serve, to do the work without needing recognition." Claire nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, watching you these past weeks reminded me why I stayed in after Grenada, why I kept pushing when people said women didn't belong in combat roles. You didn't just prove you belong here. You showed what's possible when someone has the right training and the right mindset. Thank you, Sergeant. No, thank you, for showing these men what real excellence looks like." Claire stepped back, came to attention briefly, then walked away. But as she left, she glanced back once at Evelyn and smiled. A small smile of mutual respect between two women who'd walked different paths to the same truth. That competence speaks louder than words ever could. Later that afternoon, Steele found Evelyn sitting alone on a bench near the training grounds, staring out at the obstacle course where she'd spent so many hours proving herself. He sat down beside her without asking permission. They sat in silence for a moment, the two people connected by a man who died alone in Montana, but whose influence still rippled outward through time and training. Tell me about him, Steele said finally. Not the operator, the father. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. He made the best coffee I've ever tasted, even in Montana wilderness with a camp stove and water from a creek. Said coffee was the only reliable thing in uncertain situations. Steele smiled. He said that in Grenada too. Used to brew it in his helmet when we couldn't find anything else. He taught me to shoot when I was 8. Started with a .22 rifle that was almost as big as I was. We'd go into the mountains and he'd set up targets at different ranges. Made me calculate wind and elevation in my head before I ever touched the trigger. That sounds like Jack. Everything was a teaching moment. He never raised his voice, never got angry when I made mistakes, just showed me what went wrong and how to fix it. Over and over until I got it right. She paused. He was patient in a way I didn't appreciate until I was older. Patient enough to spend 15 years teaching someone who might never need what he was teaching. But you did need it. I needed it the moment I walked through those gates and saw how they looked at me. Steele nodded. What did he tell you about coming here? He said there would be people who underestimate me. Said to let them. Said the best weapon I have is the one they don't know I'm carrying. She smiled slightly. He was right about that. He usually was. They sat in silence again, comfortable now, shared grief, making words less necessary. Sir, can I ask you something? Anything? What was he like before all the classified operations and the hiding and the cancer? What was he like when you first met him? Steele thought about it, reaching back through 28 years of memories. He was funny, not in an obvious way, dry humor. The kind where you'd be laughing 5 minutes after he said something because it took you that long to get the joke. He loved coffee, like I said, but he also loved books. Always had a paperback in his rucksack, Louis L'Amour westerns mostly. Said they reminded him that hard men doing hard things in hard places was nothing new. Evelyn laughed softly. He still read those, had boxes of them in Montana. I must have read every Louis L'Amour book ever written. He was also incredibly patient, like you said. Could sit in one position for hours without moving if the mission required it. But if something was wrong, if he saw someone being treated unfairly, or if standards were being compromised, he'd speak up immediately. Didn't matter who it was. He had this moral compass that was absolutely inflexible. He taught me that, Evelyn said softly. Said if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. That sounds exactly like something Jack would say. Steele reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I have something for you. Was going to wait until graduation, but this seems like the right moment. Evelyn took the envelope carefully. Inside was an enlarged photograph protected by archival paper. She pulled it out. The image showed 12 men in combat gear standing in front of a shot-up building. Grenada 1983, based on the equipment and the setting. They looked tired, dirty, but alive and smiling the way soldiers smile when they've survived something they weren't sure they'd survive. Third from the left was a younger version of Colonel Steele, and next to him, arm around his shoulders, was Jack Ashford. He was maybe 39 in this photo, lean, hard, eyes sharp with intelligence and focus. The same eyes that Evelyn saw in the mirror every morning. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced her father's face with one finger. I thought you might want to see him in his prime, Steele said quietly. Before the cancer, before Montana, when he was just a soldier doing impossible things with impossible people. Thank you, sir. Her voice was thick. I don't have many pictures of him from his service years. He destroyed most of them when he went into hiding. This is yours now. Keep it. Remember it. Remember that he was real, that what he did mattered, and that you're carrying that forward. She nodded, carefully sliding the photograph back into its protective envelope. He would have wanted you to know something else, Steele said. The reason he agreed to go into hiding, to give up everything he'd built in the military, wasn't because they forced him. It was because he had you. He wanted to live long enough to teach you everything he knew. The Pentagon offered him the deal, and he took it because it meant more time with his daughter. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears again. I never knew that. He wouldn't have told you, but I made some calls after I figured out who you were. Talked to people who processed his transition. He could have fought it, could have exposed the operations that made them nervous, but he chose you instead. Chose 15 years in Montana teaching his daughter over whatever glory or recognition he might have gotten by going public. That's why he was so insistent, Evelyn said quietly. Why he pushed so hard. Why every lesson mattered so much. He was running out of time and he knew it. He was making sure you'd be ready for whatever came next. They sat together until the sun started dropping toward the horizon, turning the Kentucky sky orange and red and purple. Finally, Steele stood. 3 weeks until graduation. You're going to finish first in class. Distinguished honor graduate. First woman to earn that designation in this course's history. Oh, sir, it's not up for debate, Ashford. You've earned it 10 times over. The scores don't lie. And after graduation, you're going to Fort Bragg for special operations assessment. Already submitted the paperwork. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just keep being the soldier your father raised you to be. He started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing, that tattoo. You earned the right to wear it through everything you've done here. But more than that, you earned the right to wear it through 15 years of training with a man who knew he was dying and wanted to make sure his legacy lived on. Don't ever hide it again. I won't, sir. 3 weeks later, graduation day arrived with the same brutal Kentucky heat that had greeted the recruits on their first day. 27 had started, 18 finished. Evelyn Ashford graduated first in class, distinguished honor graduate, the first woman to earn that designation in the course's 30-year history. When her name was called, the applause was thunderous, not perfunctory, not polite, genuine recognition of someone who'd earned every single accolade through demonstrated excellence. She walked across the stage in dress uniform, her bearing perfect, her expression composed. Steele pinned the Distinguished Graduate Medal on her chest, then stepped back and saluted her again, officially this time, for the record. She returned it crisply and moved to join the other graduates. Among them stood Brock Callahan and Wade Thornton. They'd both passed the final exercise. Both earned their graduation. But there was something different about them now, something humbled. They'd learned a lesson that couldn't be taught in any manual or briefing, that excellence comes in unexpected packages, that assumptions are dangerous, that the quiet ones might be the most capable of all. After the ceremony, as families and friends celebrated, Evelyn found herself standing with Steele one final time. What comes next for you, he asked. Fort Bragg in 2 weeks, then wherever they send me, wherever I'm needed. You'll excel there. And Evelyn, it was the first time he'd used her first name. Yes, sir. When you get there, when you're working with people who are the best of the best, remember something. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone. You already are what they're trying to become, what your father was. So just be yourself, that's enough. She smiled. Thank you, sir, for everything. Thank me by living up to that tattoo, by being the kind of soldier your father was, the kind who serves in the shadows and asks for nothing in return. I will, sir. She saluted one final time and he returned it. Then she walked away toward a future that her father had prepared her for without ever knowing exactly what shape it would take. 12 years later, Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan. The operations center hummed with controlled energy, radios crackling, computer screens showing drone feeds and satellite imagery, officers coordinating complex operations across multiple provinces. In a small briefing room off the main floor, Captain Evelyn Ashford stood in front of a mixed group of soldiers, men and women, different services, different specialties, but all of them here for the same reason. They were learning how to be snipers. She'd been doing this for 18 months now, training the next generation of precision shooters for counterinsurgency warfare, teaching them not just how to shoot, but how to think, how to move, how to exist in hostile territory and complete missions that saved lives, the way her father had taught her. A young female specialist, maybe 22 years old, raised her hand during the break. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Some of the guys in my unit say women don't have what it takes for this kind of work, that we're too emotional, too weak. How do you deal with that? Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned around and pulled up the back of her uniform shirt. The tattoo was there, aged now, but still clearly visible. Still carrying the weight of legacy and sacrifice in 15 years of training in Montana mountains. The specialist's eyes went wide. Black Operations Group, Evelyn said quietly, lowering her shirt and turning back around. My father's unit. He gave me this tattoo a week before he died. Told me to earn it. Did you, ma'am? Every single day, through people who doubted me, through sabotage and mockery, and every kind of obstacle you can imagine. And you know what I learned? What, ma'am? That respect isn't given, it's earned. One mission at a time, one shot at a time, one moment of excellence that can't be denied or explained away. You don't change people's minds by arguing with them. You change their minds by being so good at what you do that they can't ignore it. The specialist nodded slowly. My father taught me something else, Evelyn continued. He said the best tribute to those who came before us is making sure those who come after us are ready, that we owe it to the next generation to pass on what we know. She looked around at all of them. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to teach you everything my father taught me, everything I've learned, and you're going to take that knowledge and use it to keep your people alive, to complete missions that matter, to serve in the shadows the way the best operators always have. Yes, ma'am, they said in unison. As the briefing ended and the students filed out, a senior NCO approached. Captain, you've got a visitor. Says he served with your father. Evelyn's heart jumped. She walked to the reception area and found Colonel Garrett Steele wearing the eagles of a full colonel, now standing with his hands clasped behind his back. He was grayer, more weathered, but his eyes were the same. Sir, she said, coming to attention. At ease, Captain. I'm not here officially, just passing through on my way to Kabul. Thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing. I'm doing well, sir, training the next generation. I heard. Also heard your students have the lowest casualty rates and highest mission success rates in theater. She shrugged slightly. I teach them what works. You teach them what your father taught you. Yes, sir. Steele smiled. He'd be proud, Evelyn, incredibly proud. I hope so, sir. I know so, because I knew him. And I know that what you're doing right now, this is exactly what he would have wanted. They stood together in the Afghan heat, two people connected by a man who died alone in Montana 13 years earlier, but whose influence still rippled outward. Thank you, sir, Evelyn said quietly, for believing in me at Fort Campbell, for seeing what was underneath. Thank you for proving my faith was justified. He shook her hand, then headed back toward the flight line. That evening, alone in her quarters, Evelyn pulled out the photograph Steele had given her 12 years earlier. Her father and his team in Grenada, young and capable of anything. She studied his face, seeing the same features she saw in the mirror. The same eyes, the same determination. Then she opened her notebook and began writing not a letter this time, but notes for tomorrow's training. Lessons learned, techniques refined, the accumulated wisdom of 17 years since her father's death, passing it forward, the way he taught her, the way legends never really die. They just change form and continue in the hands of those who carry them forward. Outside, the Afghan night was full of the sounds of aircraft and training and soldiers preparing for missions that would never make the news. And somewhere in all that vast darkness, Jack Phantom Ashford's legacy lived on. Not in records or medals or official recognition, but in every shot fired from the shadows, in every mission completed without fanfare, in every soldier trained to serve with honor and skill, and the quiet competence that defined the best operators who ever lived. Some legends don't die. They just find new hands to carry the torch. And the light keeps burning.